Hey! Today I want to make a sculpture of two characters from an anime called Demon Slayer, and I will start with Gyutaro. He's going to be holding all the weight of the sculpture with his legs, so I want to have a very sturdy armature. I'll do that by using some thick wire and wrapping it once. I later realized that the ankles would be too thick, so I'll change it a bit later, but let's ignore that for now. After bending the wire into a pose I want to use, I'll cover it with Sculpey bacon bond so the clay grips better to it. For sculpting, I'm using Cosclay. It's a clay that hardens once baked. I'll start by mapping out a base body shape and then working on the details. The man is built like a tortilla chip, so I'll give him a super thin waist and wide shoulders. I'm not sure what he eats to be able to be on the verge of death skinny, but still have very muscular arms and shoulders. And of course, he also gets a six-pack like any hot anime man would. To make the legs thinner, I cut off one layer of the wire and covered them with Apoxie Sculpt, which will make them very sturdy without adding too much volume. He supposedly also has muscular legs, but they are covered with very baggy pants, so we will never know. For some reason, I really struggled with making this wrapped layered look, but eventually we got there. I made his face separately so I can bake it, otherwise I would ruin it along the sculpting process. This was a long process and hard to film, so here it is. After baking, I'll attach his face to the rest of his head and then to his body. He's going to remain bald for quite some time, but he'll get a hair transplant later. And I'll give him some quite muscular arms and shoulders. Before making the rest of the arms, I'll make his weapons. He's wielding a pair of kama fashioned from his own flesh and blood. I'll make the base shape and bake it so I can add details on top without ruining it. And the details are just this fleshy looking thing wrapped around the base. These were one of my favorite things to make for this sculpture since I really enjoy making little details like this. I'll give those another bake and then attach them to the sculpture with UV resin. And finish off the arms with his hands wrapped around the weapons. He also has some kind of fabric wrapped around his neck and arms. I think originally the pieces are separate, but I'll wrap one long piece of fabric around him instead. Lastly, he finally gets a tinfoil hat and a hair transplant, but sadly his body rejected it, so he will stay bald a bit longer. Lastly, I forgot to add veins on his arms, so I'll do that now with Sculpey bacon bond. So for the paint job, I'm using acrylic paints. I was originally planning to do quite a bit with the airbrush, but then I realized I'm really bad at it, so I'm gonna stick to what I know this time, and then maybe in future videos I can bring out the airbrush a bit more. I did, however, use the airbrush to spray a base coat of white, and I'll go over his skin with a very pale, lifeless color. I then added a darker shade into all the crevices to accent how skinny he is. And then a lighter tone on the raised parts. He has some dark markings on his skin, but as far as I could find, it's not really explained why or what they really are. Not only is he starving, the poor man also has jaundice, so I painted his eyes yellow. And I drew on some of the finer details with a very thin marker pen. His pants get a darker blue tone, and then I went over them with a lighter dry brush. This floating fabric was super annoying to paint since I had to paint all the little gaps between his arms and the fabric while trying my best not to get any paint on his skin. The last thing to paint are his meat weapons, so I'll paint the bone parts a darker red and the top a lighter pink. I'll go over the weapons with a gloss varnish to give them that fleshy look, and we can move on to Daki. I will quickly undo all the painting and make sure her armature fits on his shoulders. I'll start by making the legs first, including all the details like her stockings, so I can hold the sculpture by the legs while I make everything else. She is wearing traditional Japanese footwear. I'll bake it first and then attach her feet to them. And then attach her feet to the rest of the sculpture. For some reason, her battle outfit is a bikini, but it's a very common theme in shows and games to dress female characters in very revealing outfits. But hey, at least Gyutaro is also wearing only pants. And her bikini gets some cute bows on the sides. I then baked her legs and made the rest of the body. I haven't watched the whole anime, so I didn't know too much about their background story. I read some things while looking into the characters, and their story is actually quite sad. I won't go into the lore here, but if you are interested in the characters, you should look it up, and maybe even watch the anime if you haven't already. I also made her face off camera, the same way I made Gyutaro's. She has quite a lot of hair accessories. I'll put them in to mark where to add them later, but I will take them out now while painting. I'll then add thin wire armatures for her hands. I thought the biggest problem in this sculpture for me would be their faces, but it turned out to be Daki's hands. For some reason, I find it really hard to make fingers. She has a belt around her waist that's worn with traditional Japanese clothing. And in her case, she also uses it for her powers. So if you haven't seen the anime, you have no idea what I'm talking about. Long story short, both of these characters are demons. And they have unique powers that they can use. For Gyutaro, he creates his weapons out of his flesh, and Daki creates these long strips of her belt out of her flesh. Which I know sounds crazy, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. We're not even going to talk about regeneration, levitation, Gyutaro implanting one of his eyes into Daki's forehead, or them pretty much sharing a body even though they are two people and they are also brother and sister, which just makes it super weird. So that's all you need to know for now. I didn't like how thick it turned out, so I remade it a bit smaller. I sanded it all to make sure it's nice and smooth and painted it pink. This piece has a lot of detail work, so I'll start by painting on the colors and drawing on all these smaller lines and details with a thin marker pen because there is no way I could ever do that with a paintbrush. I later also painted on some flowers, but I didn't film it. Daki herself gets painted pretty much the same as Gyutaro, only slightly paler. She doesn't have jaundice, but her eyes are also yellow. She actually has some Japanese characters engraved in her eye, but they are way too small for me to draw, so I just added some random lines to pretend that I did. I'll also use the marker to add thin, vein-like markings on her skin. Her belt gets painted pink with the same details as her flesh extension belt, and then I'll paint the rest of her outfit black and purple. I'll then glue in the hair accessories I made earlier. And then the flesh belt gets attached to her back with 2-part epoxy glue. I'll whip out the airbrush to paint their hair. Both of them have green tips, and making a nice gradient by hand would be pretty hard. These then get attached with 2-part epoxy glue as well, and Gyutaro is finally not bald, and the main characters are done. They need a nice base to stand on, so I will make one that looks like tatami mats, which is a flooring material in traditional Japanese style rooms. Cosclay is quite flexible after baking, and that's not what I want for the base, so I will use Sculpey Extra Firm for this. No special reason for using extra firm, it's just the clay I've had laying around forever since it's so firm that I find it impossible to sculpt with. I'll paint it in the color that these mats are usually portrayed in. And since I want it to look like a more messy battle room, I'll go over the base with a black wash and leave the tiles quite dirty. I'll then glue Gyutaro in place and add a felt sticker on the bottom to give the sculpture a nicer feel. I also want some broken stuff around the floor, so I will make a sliding door with translucent clay and brown clay for the wooden parts. I'm using brown clay here just to make the painting a bit easier, so I don't later get brown paint all over the translucent parts. I'll make a piece of a broken sliding door, as well as some broken pieces, and then glue them all over the base. Lastly, I'll add Daki on his shoulders, and that's it. So, this is the finished sculpture. I really hope you enjoyed watching. Let me know down in the comments if you have any other great ideas for things I could make. I have a few bigger scale projects planned, but Those will take quite a bit of time and money, so until then, thank you for watching and I'll see you next time. Bye!